the standard that we have today is standard 13, and it's a pretty straightforward standard. It does only apply to long-term home visitation programs. So if you are joining us from a short-term home visitation program or a group-based program, the standard would not apply to you. So you don't necessarily have to be here for that. But also, if you work in a couple of different programs, just kind of keep in mind that this really only applies for long-term programs, but that's not to say that some of the elements from it might not be applicable to a short-term or a group-based program in terms of just kind of how you close families out and what kind of some of those processes are. There might be some things that you learned today that you're like, yeah, that could work in a different program as well. And so that's up to you. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Like I said, we're covering standard 13, case closing and aftercare. And so we'll go through kind of some of our beginning topics that we always make sure to cover, just to make sure that everybody is aware of these things, because they are kind of some things that I hear sometimes that people are forgetting about. The main one here is just that reminder that revision dates on policies and procedures are required as of July 1st, 2018, in order to be eligible for an expedited renewal. So if you're thinking that you're a program that would want to take advantage of an expedited renewal, or you have earned above 90% in adherence on your last peer review report, this is something you have to have in place. You have to be tracking any dates that there's been a revision to any policies, and then also what those revisions are. So there's a couple different ways to do it. You can do it right on the policy itself, like the first example here at the top, where we have the dates of revision specifically delineated out there. So it'll be really easy to go in and be like, oh yeah, we have changed this since the last peer review, so this is something we need to look at. Or you can keep track of it on a separate document that has like maybe the revised dates, like all of the different revised dates on there. I just had a program that does it this way, and it was super easy then for us as we were talking through standards that we needed to include on the expedited renewal. It was really easy to go in and determine what we needed to dig in a little bit more and see what those revisions were to see if they would apply. If it's a change that's like you change the name of the program or the name of something very like the name of a form or whatever, that's not a big enough change. But if it's like you changed who does something or when they do something or how often they do something, that would be something that we would want to make sure to include in the have that one looked at again in the expedited renewal. The other thing we always talk about at the beginning of all these calls are all these webinars are the difference between policy and procedure, and that's just because you're going to hear me use those a lot as we get into the webinar, and I want to be really clear about what I'm talking about because they do mean two different things. And I know sometimes we use them and I hear them used interchangeably. I try really hard not to use them interchangeably because within the scope of the Iowa Family Support Credential, they do mean two different things. So policies are those policies that are broad in application. They have that kind of that general guiding principle, talk about what or why, what do you do? These rarely change. They're usually broad enough that they don't change very often. They're not those down to the very specific pieces. Usually they're approved by a board or there's like a policy review committee or something like that. For organizational standards, those would be the ones that are approved by the board or leadership or something like that. For procedures, those are more narrow in application. They describe those specific processes or protocols. In there, we'll see those descriptions of how, when, who, those kinds of things. And these are the things that we do see change more often than not. Sorry, I'm just admitting people here to the room. So those are the things that we see change in between peer reviews sometimes, where maybe a title changes, a position changes, the person who's doing it, there's some restructuring within the organization or whatever. There's where we might see some changes. Generally speaking, those don't need board approval, though it could be something that would the board would approve or leadership would approve. And then as we're going through the webinar today, you'll kind of see this little logo down here that says the IFSC procedure boost. These are those things that, like, if you haven't looked at your policies in a while, look for that logo on the things that, like, these are the things we might want to think about adding, because these are the things that are we're getting more descriptive about in the peer review. And those are the things that we're asking for additional clarification and in your policy or your procedures, really primarily, to call out, because it does make it easier for the peer reviewers to know what they're looking for. There's less guesswork on their part. So they don't have to interpret, does this meet the standard? Does this not meet the standard? I think this is what this means. There's less of those questions for them where they can, and so then, the more that it's delineated out in the procedure, the more they're going to be able to say, yep, this is what the program does. This is how they say they do it. I know exactly how to go find that now in, the participant file or the training file or whatever that is. Okay, and then this is just an example. To some people, I know this looks a little messy. To me and to other people, it makes more sense. And it's kind of like this big dark red box is your policy, those very broad things. Within that policy, you might have, this bright red, I don't know, more procedures. So there could be a couple of procedures within a policy, and it gets a little bit more specific. So, and then there's this lighter red, more of like a salmon almost color with, it could even get even more specific depending on funder. Another way to look at it is if you think of it kind of as like the hierarchy, like the organization and a department and then a funder. So policy could be organization wide, but then there might be different procedures based on which department or even based on what funder it's in. So for those that's brains work on graphic examples, this could be an example of maybe a way to see that. So, all right, we'll dig right into standard 13 then. And there's a lot of words on this page and a lot of, underlining and stuff like that. There's a lot of components to this standard that, and a lot of things a lot of different ways to think about it. So I wanted to try to bring all of that together. So first of all, we define what case closing is. It's a planned, orderly process. The organization helps the family develop a plan for obtaining follow-up services. So this is for the whole standard. This is the first order standard. And a couple of things we want to note here is some definitions. What is the definition of case closing and the definition of aftercare? A lot of times those get used interchangeably. And for the purposes of the Iowa Family Support Credential, those do really mean two different things. Case closing could be a voluntary or involuntary process. It occurs when the organization is no longer assuming responsibility for providing services to that particular group or family or child. Sometimes we might call it a termination or transition. Discharge might be another word that we hear in there. We try to develop common language for the Iowa Family Support Credentials. So when we say something, we use that same phrase and we're defining what things mean. So we try to be really specific on what case closing means. So if we're talking about closing a family from services, whether it be voluntary, involuntary, planned or unplanned, we try to talk about it in terms of case closing. Aftercare goes a little bit above and beyond. This is kind of that additional services that are provided beyond that primary care that offer continuity and support follow-up beyond primary care, like after you're kind of have identified that a family is ready to close. It's that preparing for the lead up to closing a family, and then maybe even a little bit after what happens after the family is closed from services, if there's a need to like follow up with them and a month later after the closure has happened and visits have stopped to kind of check in and see where they're at. But that process of like planning for case closure at the end and identifying supports and services and all of that things, that's aftercare planning, and that applies specifically to one standard here. When we get there, it'll be very obvious. So standard 13.01, a couple of things I wanted to do with these standards is identify when things are appropriate or when things are applicable, and then identifying whether they apply to planned and unplanned closures, whether they apply, what types of programs they apply to. So these are going to be applied. These will apply to long-term home visitation programs with a group component or without a group component, both. So that's kind of the first thing. Planning for case closing is one, a clearly defined process that includes assignment of staff responsibility. So throughout the entire process, it's really clear in policy and procedure what the staff's responsibility is there. Planning for case closing begins at intake. We'll talk through that a little bit more. And then involves the provider, family members, and others as appropriate. We'll talk through that a little bit more as well. Some things we want to specify here is planning is, what planning really is. It's the process of specifying objectives, evaluating the means for their achievement, and exercising deliberate decisions about those appropriate courses of action. So planning is a really a purposeful thing. That's what we're getting at there in that definition. What does intake mean? And that kind of seems like a, kind of a silly question, but for the purposes of the standard, we really want to make sure we're clear of that. Intake is the client's entry point for services at which eligibility is assessed and established then against established criteria. So intake is really as soon as we are identifying that family is or is not eligible for services, that's what intake is. So when we talk about beginning at intake, that's what we mean by that. And then family members, we want to make sure that we are including whomever the family wants to make sure or wants to have included in the case closing process. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along here. So for policy, we're looking at what does the program do? Why does they do it? Why do they do it? Or why does the program do it? This is more, and I guess the one thing I want to say here about standard 13.01, this is more than just telling the family when the services end, especially that component that is that they begin at intake. So if we're saying services end when your child turns 5, or services end, at whatever, this standard is asking for more than that. We don't want to just say this is what it is, and that meets the standard for, starting an intake. It's that purposeful bringing in of integrating like case closing planning, which could also be a component of like service planning in every component of, every visit as you move from beginning of services towards the end of services, is getting families ready to close. What's the work doing? How does that work with service planning? It's that purposeful plan of what you're doing, and that it meets not just the family's goal plans, but also the plan and kind of the structure of what the program is designed to do, program design kind of things. So what is included for planning? What is included in planning for case closures? What are the components? We want to be thinking about closing of all cases here, not just planned closures. We're talking unplanned and planned closures. This is not the planning that occurs at the end of services as well. A lot of times that's what we see here on this, as for the standard. And this is, we want to be definitely thinking about the beginning of services and how that is ingrained in the purposefulness that the approach for every family. So clearly the program also should have like a clearly defined graduation point, and that should complement the program's purpose and goals. That the family kind of knows what to expect from beginning to end. There is kind of that end of services time frame, and it doesn't have to be exact. We don't have to say on August 25th of 2022 you will close. That's not what we're really looking for there, but that there's some sort of criteria for when the family, if they were active the whole time and were continued in services, like what the closing would look like when the child goes to preschool, the child goes to kindergarten, those kinds of things. So and really that piggybacks on when to start things for aftercare planning in 1304. And then also you should be planning for the work of the program to get the family ready to leave the program. We talked about that a little bit. And that's not just the last month of services, that's the whole time through. And that should be reflected in policy and procedure. And this is, we kind of hear in procedure, but so this standard this slide is on that procedure. So the staff responsibility from intake, the procedure outlines what the role of staff is in getting the family ready to leave the program. It's going to be based on the program's purpose and goals and what the family's goals are there. I've seen some really cool things here where The family's goal plan, the goal plan that the family sets for themselves is kind of done in cohesion with this case closing plan, and really is kind of the process that the procedures are enmeshed in one another, which actually I think is kind of cool way to think about that and to go about doing that. Because if you think, if you're including the family's goals in there, then it makes sense that that could be part of the process. And then involve the provider, family members, and others as applicable from intake. So planning for a case closing is done with the family, not for the family. So if you think about it as like, it's like a joint process where each kind of group, the staff, the family, whomever else the family wants to involve in things, that it's done together, not just here you are, here's what it looks like, here's what's happening. Think about where it's documented, and then kind of the end part of all of these standards are really like, okay, how will peer reviewers, how will anyone that we're looking at this, funders perhaps, know when this happens, know when it starts, know when that it has happened for this family. Like, how are we going to show evidence of it? And planning for case closure just doesn't happen once. It goes on throughout services. So for practice, this slide is kind of not always super applicable for the discussions, but it does kind of show you things we would commonly expect to find in the box for as relates to this standard. So rights and responsibilities, if it includes that clients are told at case closing about, or I'm sorry, told at enrollment about case closing and how it starts at intake. Again, that's not the only component, but that could be a component. Case closing forms, and definitely you want to highlight on these forms that are specific to this standard. So highlight where the family members involved is noted. Make sure that the peer reviewers can find that when you're submitting your evidence. Make sure that it's something that, somebody who's never looked at that before could look at it and be like, okay, I know where this is documented. And take that, even that next step is like, when I see this in participant files, I'm going to know where to go to look to find this, rather than reviewers being like, I think this is what they're saying here. I think this is where this goes, and having for them having to guess at it. Case notes showing case closing discussion. That could be something that's talked about pretty regularly in case notes. So where is that going to be in your case notes? Or the tracking of case closing. There are forms for that. Some programs do have forms that are kind of track those steps of case closing. If the process is delineated out, we're going to talk at 6 months, we're going to talk, at 5 months, we're going to talk at 4 months, and these are the things we're going to do at each one of those moments before case closing. It might be something that you would want to include in there. Highlight then, of course, where the necessary components are at. And then in the actual PHI portal itself, which is where the evidence will go, where the case files, like completed participant files, will go. These are the things that the peer reviewers might be looking at. There might be other things in there too, like that aren't specifically case files or participant files, like exit reports. That might be something that the supervisor or the individual staff workers are reviewing. Signed forms, all of those kinds of things. And when you're looking at the practice, this page for each standard, just keep in mind it's not that these things are required. These are just kind of the common things that we see in there. So I also included some kind of common missteps for 1301. The first one is that, the planning for case closing is not a clearly defined process. It doesn't include staff responsibilities. It doesn't include or have a mechanism that includes all the family members. Kind of just talked about how that's required. And then documentation should address that it was initiated at intake. So how are you going to show that it was initiated at intake? How do you kind of demonstrate that it was part of the process all along? And then include the actual documentation of the case closing. I don't, for some reason, it's a weird kind of phenomena, but there's a lot of times where there's just not a ton of documentation on case closings unless it's a planned closure, which I get it. Unplanned closures sometimes happen rather sudden, and maybe you don't get a chance to meet with that family one last time to wrap everything up all nicely. But like your policy or your procedures really should outline like what to do in those scenarios. What could an unplanned case closure look like? If the family's like, it just calls and maybe they call and tell you they don't want services anymore, or maybe they just don't respond to you for a couple of months and you make the decision to close, like your policies still or your procedures still need to like outline what to do in those scenarios and how you can show adherence to the standard in those scenarios. I get that the documentation might look different, but there's definitely ways to still make sure that all of the necessary components still get addressed. And we talked here about, I guess I just kind of talked about this misstep number 2 is that there's no documentation of the case closing. There's just no way to know then that the family was informed about the circumstances surrounding case closing. There was no way to know, whatever components was not found if there's no documentation of it. So standard 2, and again, so upon case closing, the organization notifies any collaborating service providers, including the courts, as appropriate. This again is a standard that applies to both planned and unplanned closures, but the procedure may look different between each type of case closure. So I see a lot of times that we've got a pretty good outline of the process for planned closures, but it's a little bit harder to do in unplanned closures. And so your procedure really needs to address that as well. What happens when you didn't see it coming or you didn't get a chance to meet with the family before they close? Like, you can still do these things, especially, well, it's a little bit more applicable in 1303, but and then again, long-term home visitations with or without a group component. So for policy, what collaborating community partners are important to notify if the family is closing from services? So I'm not saying you should list them out. That's not what I'm saying here. But in your policy, how will staff and then how will reviewers know what is included in there? So think about your releases of information. Think about, definitely you need to include the courts as applicable because that's the hardest spelled right out there in the standard. So make sure you do that. And then think about the differences between planned and unplanned closures. What is done for a planned closure? What is done for an unplanned closure? The procedure for each of these, it's kind of the same, but the procedure should identify who notifies them, how, like the collaborating service provider, how are they notified? Where is it documented that they're notified? How does staff know who to notify? Like like before I said, like releases of information, the courts, like how does that structure work? And really, I would say those are probably 2 of the primary ones. We want to definitely make sure that you have a release of information with anyone that you notify. So that might be kind of your first check is like, who do we have releases of information with? And then who are we collaborating, like collaborating being the key word there with for this family that would need to know if we've closed them. But then for unplanned closures, you might have a release of information that you've been working, for it's a year-long release of information because you had been working with a collaborating service provider, and then the family just kind of all of a sudden up and closed. They said they didn't want services anymore. But because you had been collaborating with that community service provider, you might still want to notify them of that closure. So if the process might look different for unplanned closures, it might not, but make sure you're considering both. For practice, this is pretty much the same. On this one, we would expect to see forms that are used to notify collaborating service providers, releases of information, the case closing form itself, and then some programs will have like a log that is where they like, these are who we followed up with. This is who we notified. If there were more than, well, it could be one, there could be none, there could be several. But like where they log everybody that they needed to contact, when they were contacted, that kind of thing. So it's really easy to just like see it right there that it was done. And then in the PHI portal, it'd be those completed forms, how or when they were notified, and completed releases of information. Some common missteps that I see for 1302, the policy lacks clarification on what a notifying collaborating service provider means for the program, or lacks clarification on how it's done, or when for family support professionals, how do they know when to notify them? The procedure should really clearly call that out. The procedure definitely needs to include the courts. I've had this conversation, it feels like a couple of times lately, where it was like, oh, the courts are new. No, the courts, that component to include the courts is actually not new. I went back and pulled even the original version of the Iowa Family Support Standards, and it's not. I think it's just oftentimes overlooked, and maybe it's in the way that it's worded. This isn't a standard that's out of adherence a lot, to be really honest, but these are some of the reasons why they might be. The procedure should specify, specifically outline a mechanism to notifying collaborating service providers. Like, it should walk through the process step by step by step. A lot of times we'll just see the policy will say, we notify them, but it doesn't tell reviewers or staff how that's done. So they have no idea how to go about actually doing it. And the policy and procedure, the other misstep would be that the policy and procedure outlines it. However, it's only done, for some reason, it's only getting done in planned case closures. And then again, just wanted to call to everybody's attention that this is intended for planned and unplanned closures. So anytime a family is closed, that needs to be done. Now, it very well could be. The other thing that we kind of might see frequently is that there are no collaborating service providers. I recognize that probably happens quite frequently. So the check there would be like, how would reviewers know then that was the case for that particular family, that they would have notified collaborating service providers, but there wasn't anybody to notify. So, if there's a form that says, like, did you notify collaborating service providers, yes or no, or not applicable, that they would check not applicable. And if they checked yes, they would fill out who. If they, I don't know why you would check no, because would be pretty simple then to just do it if there was a checklist to do it. I don't know. But I think that we do get that a lot, where it's like, oh, I didn't realize that needed to happen for unplanned closures as well. Standard 1303, if the family leaves the program for whatever reason, the organization makes every effort to link family members with appropriate services. Again, this is another standard that applies to both planned and unplanned case closures, which I recognize that that's going to look different. And you're probably saying to yourself, how in the world would we link family members with appropriate services if we didn't even know they were closing? And there's ways we can talk through some of that. This is applicable again to group long-term home visitation programs with or without a group component. So some things to kind of think about is what does work. Oh golly, that's a typo. What works? How do you ensure, like, what are you doing to make sure that families closing from services are provided with any resources that they might need? What linking is done? What do you mean by linking? What is that? Is it a community resource guide? Is it family specific? And that could be kind of maybe some of the differences between a planned and unplanned closure. If it's a planned closure, you've had some time to work through, what services the families might need upon closure. What they might need. You've had time to talk through it. If it's an unplanned closure, you maybe not. Maybe you haven't. You kind of have an idea about what they need. Where they're at. But if you haven't talked to them in 3 months or however long, before they finally closed out, like you might not know exactly what's going on at that moment for that family. So providing them with a community resource guide could be something that would be helpful. You could mail that out to them, or I know that even now some of those community resource guides are fully electronic, so you can text them the link for that. And even for unplanned closures, though, that a family, let's think that, so like it may be an example where you hear back from a family, they're like, sorry, I haven't texted you, or we haven't set up a visit in the last couple of weeks. I just found out we're going to be moving to another state. So it could be that, the what you provide them in that, even though it's an unplanned closure, could be some resources for family support available, like that are family support programs that are available in that other state or in that other location, or maybe just the next county over, even. That you kind of tell them, like, hey, but here's some services that are similar to what we do in that location. Even though it's an unplanned closure, you haven't had time to like work through an aftercare plan. You're able to provide some family specific things. So, you know, in policy, you want to kind of think through both of those things. What does linking a family um, with services they might need look like in both of those scenarios when it's both planned and unplanned? Same kind of thing here. So for planned closures, where is it? Where's that linking families with appropriate services? Where is it documented? Is it part of the aftercare discharge planning process? Probably. How will family support professionals know which services to link the family to? It's probably delineated out in that aftercare plan, and it's probably part of that follow up. So that stuff, it makes sense that that would be kind of all 1303 and 1304 might kind of blend together. And then are those services family specific? Do they need to be family specific? Probably for a planned closure, yes. For an unplanned closure, where is it documented? How will family support professionals know which services to link the family to? Again, your procedure can kind of outline some, like, at a minimum, it's this, maybe a community resources guide. However, if you have more information about it, there might be some additional things that you could include in there, however you want to word that for the program. And then how are families given information about these services? I know some programs will send things, send some resources in the mail. Maybe you don't have a ton of information about the family. You don't suspect that they're moving, but maybe there's some upcoming community events that you want to notify them of. I guess one of the things that's been in my brain right now is maybe, the family's got some school age kids and might have some difficulty obtaining back to like school supplies for them. So maybe you've got some resources that you could email, or you could, like a flyer or whatever that you could print off and send in the mail to them about that particular thing. I think, maybe we're moving away from needing to print everything off and mail it to them, but it sure doesn't hurt to do that, or to mail them that closing letter. Maybe you want to have them complete a survey of, because they're closing. So maybe that's the way you do it anyhow. But there, you can consolidate some things there as well. If you're doing, like I said, if you're doing some other things because they're closing, you could maybe incorporate this notifying them about, or linking them with appropriate services into those parts of the process. For practice, we might see the aftercare discharge plan documents. We might see some referral logs or some releases of information. Definitely probably going to see the case closing forms where that's maybe filled out, like what services or what link, how did you link them with any community services? What did you give the family? That kind of thing. Also might see it in a home visit record or contact notes, maybe not so much on the contact or the home visit record if it's an unplanned closure, but definitely in contact notes that are like, documenting like a text message or any other contact made with the family outside of a home visit record. You might document there then some of those things as well. For 1303, some common misstep is, again, it just kind of comes back to that planned and unplanned closure, that the policy and procedure is really solid on planned closures, or that they just don't it's just hard to see like proof that it's being done, where there's not a way to like formalize documentation on it. And so the reviewers, when they're looking at it, are like, well, I don't really know for sure that it's being done. There's not a place to fill anything in on a form. There's not a checkbox. There's not an anything. Can't say conclusively based on the evidence. That's especially hard on those unplanned closures. So I think if there was one thing I could that you would take from this from this webinar today is really that standards 1301 through 1303 Those are all case closings. 1304, which we're going to get to, is going to be those planned case closures. And here we are. So this is, again, those planned ones. Families and providers work together to develop aftercare plans that are developed sufficiently in advance of case closing to ensure an orderly transition, identify services needed or desired by family members, and specify steps for obtaining these services. In the interpretation, it does say some things that I think are kind of important, that, you know, the decision to develop an aftercare plan should be based on the wishes of the family unless aftercare is mandated. So, you know, if the family's like, no, we're good, we don't need to do that, if that's okay with your program, you know, that could be an option. However, you would want to make sure then that that it's documented that that's what happened, so that if a reviewer were to look at that, they wouldn't just be like, nope, they didn't do it. They would see that it was something that the family didn't want or need or request. And the organization is expected to be strongly proactive with respect to aftercare planning. That means, you know, these aftercare plans shouldn't be like this thing you have to do. It should be a thing that you do because it benefits the family. Making sure that you've got all of these pieces are in place and are preparing the family for like what to do when there's no one coming to visit with them anymore. That's important for the family to be successful, you know, after they've closed. So, you know, that the, you know, expected to be strongly proactive with respect to it. Like, if you're going to do it well, make it useful, do it, you know, make the aftercare plan like something that's useful for the families and not just a hurdle that you have to jump through to get the family closed or whatever. And again, I just defined what aftercare plan. This is applicable to both group components or long-term home visitations with a group component and without. What are the components of, so for policy, this is where you want to talk about what are the components of the aftercare or discharge planning process? What is specifically in advance? Specify a timeline, you know, 3 months, 6 months, etc. 3 months before kindergarten, 3 months before preschool, whatever that is. Like, you know, how does the family know when that kind of starts? And then how would your family support professionals know when that starts? What services and supports are families linked to in order to prepare? Again, not asking for like a comprehensive list here, just looking for like, how does your family support professional like know kind of what options there are? And then like what, you know, the family, is it focused on just early childhood development? Are you looking for like preschool preparation or kindergarten preparation, or is it wide open in there? And I think that really for most programs, it's pretty wide open, that, you know, there might be some resources or things like that are available for any number of needs for the family. What services and supports are families linked to so what do you need to prepare for case closing? And then what might you need for once services have ended? What might that family still continue to need after you've like formally closed and you're not coming anymore to meet with a family? So think about it from both perspectives, because an aftercare plan could really include both kinds of things. What input does the family have to their aftercare plan or discharge plan? Specifically to identify those needed services and supports, and then to help you kind of help put together those steps for obtaining these services and supports. Like sometimes there's just some things that still need to be done for the program or done with the family. And so then it kind of, okay, these are kind of the things to get you ready. This is how it's going to work. This is what we need to do first and second. Again, I've seen some ways that programs will use that final aftercare plan like that. You've got 6 months left in services. We're going to talk about aftercare plan and we're going to kind of start it. They use that last goal plan that they do with the family in conjunction with their aftercare plan, so that those like preparation for closing is the same. And so they can kind of integrate those two things together. And that's a good way to help families kind of think about it. And it really does focus then the home visits on not only, you know, what the family wants for their final set of goals, but then also like the home visits are kind of geared towards getting them ready. That's what a lot of the conversation is about. Follow-up is about. It, you know, aligns with what you might be bringing as curriculum for the home visits. If there's something on there that the family has identified that they Want a little bit more information about prior to closing, that kind of thing. For the procedure, um, when we talk about sufficiently in advance, we talked about like identifying that time frame. But so when is the aftercare plan started? How will reviewers know the date that the aftercare plan was started? So I guess what I'm getting at there is like, will that date be documented or recorded somewhere? Where? On what form? A lot of times I see like a aftercare, like we completed the aftercare plan on, and there's a date maybe where people sign it, like where the family support professional and the family signs it, but it's not always indicative of like the date that it started, because sometimes it takes a couple visits to kind of nail that down. So how do you kind of know? And that might be that you talk about it in the contact notes or the home visit records, but your procedure can kind of um, spell that out for the reviewers so they know kind of when to go, where to go check and look for it. Where is the aftercare plan documented? We'll talk about that one on one of the missteps. Who completes and signs the aftercare plan? What is the, do you all agree on it? Do you sign it? Is it like a formalized kind of thing, or is it kind of, is it like a formal process that's done with the family, or is it more informal? Do they get a copy of it? That kind of stuff. Identify services needed or desired by the families, and then outline specific steps. So how are services that are needed or desired identified? How do you talk through that? What is that? Is it, again, we talked about prior to closing or after closing, like kind of framing those conversations with a family support professional, and then how they use that to frame the conversations with the families. It could, help kind of dial in that conversation. Where are the services documented? Where are the steps to obtaining these services documented? And then another one that I see, kind of that, where is that follow-up on that aftercare plan documented? So say 6 months prior to closing, you have this aftercare plan that's crafted with the family and it's got all the necessary components. But then like, where's the follow-up on that? Is it like, so like every visit, then you could kind of see that progress towards getting ready for it, because absent that progress, it kind of looks like aftercare plan developed and then family closed, boom, done. And there really should be documentation on that kind of, each step of that along the way. So what we see for practice for this one is aftercare plan or discharge plan itself, home visit records or contact notes. That's where we're going to talk about those discussions most likely. Although if you do it somewhere else, that's fine. Some programs will put it right on the aftercare plan or discharge plan. That's fine. That's perfect. It could go there too. If you do put it in your home visit records or contact notes, though, make sure you tell the reviewers and your staff where it goes. If you've got just on your home visit record just one big spot for entering in a ton of notes, how do you make sure then that all of the necessary notes made it in there, that the curriculum and the response to the curriculum and the all of the assessments and how the families did on those assessments, the child did on those assessments, like all the necessary components that you would want to have in your home visit documentation. How do you make sure all that gets in there? Or do you have specific, like kind of like, this is where this goes and this is where this goes and this is where this goes? Like, I think that sometimes when you just have it as like one giant narrative, there is definitely an opportunity for things to get missed. You might see referral logs. You might have those in there, releases of information, all kinds of things that might go in there. And then some missteps for 1304, that the policy and procedure just doesn't clarify when it should start. It says that it should start that it's sufficiently in advance, but it's unclear. And so the reviewers can't really say either. They don't know when to say like, yep, it's there, I see it, or like, I feel like sufficiently in advance means, and they're having to kind of come to a conjecture. They're having to guess at whether or not it's been developed sufficiently in advance. Like, make sure you spell that time frame out. So yeah, it should be just clearly delineated, and that's helpful for your staff too, so they know when to start it. Absolutely. Like, this is when we start it. It helps, for supervision and for case file audits too. Like, if you've got a family that you're recognizing, like, hey, we're going to be closing them in this month, and your policy says 6 months and you're 4 months before closure, like that helps, because you're like, oh, you definitely need to be getting going on this one. The other misstep that we see is that the aftercare planning is approached in the same way as case closing. And so it's kind of, we try to put it on the same document even, which is fine as long as you're meeting all the necessary components. But a lot of times they don't. That the necessary components, which, from 1304 that created sufficiently in advance, identify the needed services, specify steps for obtaining these services, they just aren't the focus of the documentation. And so they're not consistently documented. So the reviewers don't consistently find it. So I really think that it's important, since they're two separate processes, they really each should have their own form. Or if you want to put them on the same form, which is fine, make sure that you've got, maybe separate them, like the top of the form is case closure and the bottom is aftercare, if appropriate, kind of thing. We know that not every family will have an aftercare plan, and that those are only those planned closures will. But so if it's not a planned closure, then you would just put not applicable, because it's not a planned closure, or whatever the not applicable reason is. But you could put them on the same form. You just really want to make sure that you've got the necessary components for both of those. The other thing I will say is, case closing is not just closing the family in DAISY for those programs that are ECI funded, or shared visions funded. It's not just going into DAISY and doing it. There's still got to be some sort of like form that goes in the case record, because one, the families aren't able to access DAISY. So if they ask to review their file, they're not going to see that case closing. And then two, the peer reviewers don't have access to DAISY as well. So if that's what your current policy or procedure states, that it's just DAISY, you need to enhance that a bit and add to that. Come on, computer. Okay, so just some kind of wrap up things to consider. We're thinking about, how does a program ensure case closing and aftercare planning processes start at intake? How does the program ensure collaborating service providers are notified at case closing? How does the program ensure that every effort is made to link families to appropriate services? And then how does that aftercare plan make sure that it meets all of the bullet points there? So as you're kind of thinking through the standard and you think like, I think we're pretty good, I think we've got ourselves, ask yourself these questions, or look at it, like put yourself in my shoes. If Risa were looking at this, how would she know that these things are being done? If a reviewer was looking at this, how would they know that this is being done? Because sometimes, like, we're so involved in what our own program is doing that we're unable to, like, we need to remember to like step outside our own shoes and look at it from somebody else's perspective. Because when we do, then we're able to see where some of those gaps might be. And then the last couple of things are just some don't forgets. For programs that the Iowa Family Support Credential annual update form, that is due, by like Sunday. So really probably by Friday. If you have not gotten those to me yet, please do so as soon as possible. We do have some upcoming dates for our new supervisor and coordinator webinar series. We've got part 2 coming on September 1st, and then part 3 on December 1st. And then for our webinar series, I've got one link already created. The other 2 I'll be sending out via email, but the links to register are right here. Next time we're talking about personnel, it's a lengthy standard. Then we've got cultural competence, and then the next one after that, we start moving into the organizational standards, which are standard 16 and 17, open, transparent operations and conflict of interest. And that is the end of my presentation.